So part 4, reading from Teilhard and Chardin's Unit of Phenomenon. So as a result of the unity of structure and the unity of mechanism, throughout the ages there is also a unity of movement. The rise and expansion of consciousness being that unity of movement. The human is not the center of the universe, as we once naively believed, but something much finer, the rising arrow of the great biological synthesis. The human alone constitutes the last born, freshest, most complicated and subtly varied of the successive layers of life. This is nothing else than the fundamental vision, and I shall leave it at that. But keep in mind that this vision only acquires its full value, or even can only be defended, by simultaneously illuminating the laws and conditions of heredity within ourselves. Heredity. As I have already had occasion to say, we are still not aware of how characters are formed, accumulated, and transmitted deep inside the organic germ, or rather, in the genesis of phyla, insofar as it has to do with plants and animals. Biology still has not succeeded in combining the spontaneous activity of individuals with the blind determinism of genes. As a result of its inability to reconcile these two terms, it tends to make the living being the passive and powerless witness to the transformations it undergoes, with no responsibility for them or ability to influence them. But then, in human phylogenesis, and this is the place to settle the question once and for all, what becomes of the part played by the obviously important forces of invention? What evolution sees of itself in the human, as it is reflected there, is enough to dispel, or at least correct, what seems to be so paradoxical. Certainly, we all feel in our inmost being the weight or reserve of obscure powers, good or bad, a kind of definite, unalterable quantum that we have received once and for all from the past. But what we see also, and just as clearly, is that any further advance of the vital wave ahead of us depends on how industriously we use these energies. How could we have any question about this? When right before our eyes we see these energies being stored up irreversibly in the highest forms of life accessible to our experience through all the channels of tradition. I mean, in the collective memory and intelligence of the human biota. Still influenced by our underestimation of what is artificial, we instinctively consider such social functions as tradition, instruction, and education to be the pale image, the parodies even, of what happens in the natural formation of species. If the noosphere is not an illusion, is it not much truer to recognize that these communications and exchanges of ideas are the higher form in which the less supple modes of biological enrichments manage to establish themselves in us by additivity? In short, the more the living being emerges from the anonymous masses by its own radiation of consciousness, the larger becomes the share of its activity that can be transmitted and preserved through education and imitation. From this perspective, the human represents only an extreme case of transformation, carried by the human into the thinking zone of the earth. Heredity, without ceasing to be germinal or chromosomatic in an individual, has emigrated by the heart of itself into a reflective organism that is collective and permanent, where phylogenesis merges with ontogenesis. From the chain of cells, it passes into the circumterrestrial layers of the noosphere. It is not surprising that from this moment on, and thanks to the characteristics of this new milieu, that the flowering of heredity is reduced to the pure and simple transmission of acquired spiritual treasures, from being passive, as it probably was before reflection. In becoming harmonized, heredity springs up to become supremely active in its noospheric form. It was therefore not enough for us to say that all evolution has to do in becoming conscious of itself, deep within us, is to look into the mirror to see into its very depths and to fathom itself. Let me read that again. It was therefore not enough for us to say that all evolution has to do in becoming conscious of itself, deep within us, is to look into the mirror to see into its very depths and to fathom itself. It moreover becomes free to dispose of itself, to give or to refuse itself. Not only do we read the secret of its movements in our slightest acts, but to a fundamental extent, we hold it in our own hands, responsible for its past to its future. Is this greatness or bondage? This is the whole problem of action. But I'm not going to read the next section, the problem of action. You'll have to read that yourself. But, there's still 100 pages left, so there could be another series of videos of me reading if I can't help myself again. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it.